Hey, welcome back to Shadow Shorts. If we've never met before, my name is Jeff Echols. I am a senior advisor and the head of marketing for Shadow Partners. And the whole point of Shadow Shorts is for me to come to you every weekday at noon Eastern and bring a thought leader or an expert in the realm of innovation for the built environment. And so today I'm excited to bring a friend and someone that I've talked to a number of times in a number of different contexts, different shows and things. Um, to this conversation because it's a little bit unique where we've been so far in Shadow Shorts. We've never really had someone that's specifically looking at innovation in architecture. So I am joined today by the president of MANCINI DUFFY, Christian Giordano. He's also the host of the Anti-Architect podcast. And Christian is in New York today in the MANCINI DUFFY headquarters. Christian, thanks for joining me today. Looking forward to this conversation.
Jeff, as always, thanks for having me as your guest.
It's great to have you. I love our conversations. One, just because I think we click really well, but also I'm fascinated by what you do at MANCINI DUFFY and how you do it, why you do it, and how you do it. Like I said, we don't hear a lot about true innovation, as I would define it, in architecture practices. We hear about digital transformation. Hey, we're going to move from AutoCAD to Revit, or we're going to try to eke 5% more out of Revit, or something like that. We're going to add something to our tech stack. But what you're doing at MANCINI DUFFY is a little bit different. And I know you go about it. You've got it your design lab. You think about things a little bit differently. So what's different about the way that you're approaching the practice than, say, a lot of the other firms that are out there with, I'm not going to name any, but what's different about the way that you look at your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think I look at innovation just in general is that it isn't just sort of incremental steps, right? It's a
Yeah.
completely different way of approaching a problem. And so for me or for us here at MANCINI DUFFY, it's innovation in terms of culture. What's the kind of culture that we have at MANCINI DUFFY in terms of being entrepreneurial, or we call it intrapreneurial. And then there is, more, let's call it more traditional innovation from the tech side of things. And as you said, we have an entire room dedicated called the Design Lab. It's really its own studio, its own practice. It's got its own P&L. I think that one of the main things that's different for us is that we've invested a lot of money. Almost all of the profits that we've generated over the last 5 years have gone back into the design lab. We believe so down to our core that we need to find what's next for the architecture practice that we're willing to invest essentially all of our money. And that means that we have 3 full-time programmer developers that work in that lab that develop custom software for us. But that are also experimenting day to day. So, we're looking at robotics. We're looking at, and when I say robotics, it's, this idea of connecting the entire design process.
Mm-hmm.
So we invite our clients in, we show them sort of the secret sauce or what's under the hood. We open that process up to the client. And then from there, we want to connect that, and we want to be able to, whether that's build it in terms of a 3D print or a robotics building a portion of the built environment, or maybe it's drones trying to assemble portions of an interior or an exterior. We're not trying to take things away from contractors. We're just trying to experiment and see what that, and I tell you, it's gone from a very simple idea of we wanted to 3D print a chair because we thought that the chair that you rent when you have a backyard party was ugly and we could improve upon it, all the way to inventing our own drone technology and our own scanning technology and really coming at it from a totally different perspective.
Yeah, well, you mentioned looking at the way things are constructed and not taking anything away from contractors. One of the I would say top 3 or 4 topics that we at Shadow Partners are approached with. Hey, how do we do this? What's the impact of this going to be? As we look at the future and innovation for the built world, is industrialized construction.
Mhm.
And so you look across our portfolio of companies, and we have robotics and we have 3D printing in the field, right, at the
Right.
construction level. So I think it's interesting. You're taking a very similar approach from the design side, starting at the design side rather than starting at the um, you know putting wall panels together or whatever version of the industrialized construction that we're talking about is. But I think that's important, right? Looking at things holistically. What are the systems and the processes that we need to put into place to change the way that we do things? That makes sense. Obviously, not just for the sake of change. I assume.
Exactly. And it's not about, designing and bidding and building. It's for us, it's about how can we innovate on the building side? And then let's back that up. And how does that create a different design process for the
Mhm.
designers in our lab? And it's a very different way of looking at a project. It's no longer about just us showing that we are, great designers and then presenting to the client, getting some feedback, and then repeating that over and over and over and over again. It's really about getting that immediate feedback from the client and getting them to be part of that process and
Mm.
really truly understanding what their needs are, and then complementing that with the design side. There is a Listen, you could come to a superstar black cape architect, and you want a Frank Gehry building, you're going to get a Frank Gehry building. But that's not why our clients come to us. It's a very different approach, and so that's why we take a very different approach to it.
Yeah, well, and I think that to me is a thread. Right? We were talking before we went live. I teach pro practice at the graduate and undergraduate level, and we talk about project delivery and all types of things. And I think the thread, whether it's in a pro practice class or an architecture firm talking about project delivery or industrialized construction, et cetera, I think the thread is this holistic view. It's from the client all the way through the design, through the construction, et cetera. It's a different way of thinking from the very beginning to the very end. So it's nice to be able to kind of pull that thread taut and say, hey, there is a through line here that we're seeing in some architecture firms and some engineering and some construction, um, and it's probably going to change the way that we do business, change the way that we develop as
Yeah.
we look into the future.
I love that you teach professional practice, because knowing a bit about your background and
Yeah.
especially where you are at Shadow Partners, when I took professional practice in architecture school, I couldn't tell you anything about what we talked. Maybe we looked at AIA contracts. I don't even know. We wrote proposals. I think I remember that. But there was nothing about the practice of architecture in
Right.
terms of what it could be in the
Mhm.
future. And I feel like right now we are finally at the point in the practice of architecture where it's such a good education, it's such a well-rounded education. And now you've got obviously technology and computing that's part of this. And it can take the architecture profession to the next level. And so here at Mancini Duffy, we try what we call entrepreneurialism. I am very much a believer that if you have an idea, well, we can support it. And
Mhm.
that's how we've started different practice areas. And that's how we've started some of the different technologies, or even on the softer side, starting a procurement arm and a luxurious brand we call the Lux brand. It's a very different, it's a very different sensibility in terms of the way you're taught in architecture school, but you're using all of those parts and pieces. In an ideal world, I'd have a doctor, if we could pay them, I'd have a doctor run the healthcare practice. I'd have a pilot run the aviation practice. To me, we can learn so much from these other professions, but as architects, we can kind of pull it all together and create even a better experience for the users.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. And so, if as you look out, we're mid 2023 at this point, or just past the midpoint. So look out towards the end of 23 and 24 and 25 and beyond with your approach, the Mancini Duffy approach to experimentation, design lab, and everything that you've got going on. How do you, what excites you the most about what your practice could be 6 months, a year, or 5 years from now? And do you see the possibility that other firms, others that are not Mancini Duffy, can they do what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure other firms could do what we're doing. Some of the large firms certainly have the resources. The
Mhm.
question is, do they have too much of a corporate structure to kind of get in the way of all of those things? And I think at our firm, we're about 100 people. It's a good size where we're big enough, but we're not that small, where we can take time away. We can put people on non-billable things. I mean, billability is a huge thing in any architecture firm, which, trust me, I understand. So we're in that sweet spot where we can be nimble and kind of chase some rainbows when we want to chase
Mhm.
some rainbows, and kind
Yeah.
of dial it back when we want to dial it back. I think the answer of, sort of, the excitement towards the future is, I don't know. And as I said, we started with that chair and we went on such a tangent. We have a housing product that we've developed that's like no other housing product that exists. And if we could find the time and make the time, that's something that I'm excited about in the future, that I think could really revolutionize housing and how it's, not only how it's built and designed, but ultimately how it's used and delivered, especially in low income areas. So there's those aspects of things. But again, I make an announcement. We have a once a month meeting, all in meeting, and I'm constantly pressing everyone for new ideas. What are some of your ideas? Speak up. And we thought of a lawn mowing app, that we thought would be an amazing thing that we could bring to Shark Tank. Turns out somebody already had invented that. So as far as I'm concerned, we can do anything. You just got to bring the idea to us.
Sure. Yeah, that's fantastic. It sounds like a fun place to be. It actually, I mean, I guess that's a segue to a shameless plug. We just opened the application period for our fall cohort of the Shadow Partners Incubator. So if there's anybody out there that is working to solve big AEC or CRE problems, you need to apply for the incubator. Or if there's anybody out there that would like to be a mentor in that program, that's just as important. We match mentors up with teams. But what you're talking about really reminds me of an incubator. It's also the way that I run the class with my graduate students. What are the ideas and how do we develop those ideas? So
Yeah.
um, that's really exciting. When do you think, as you look out into the future, is there a possibility, and this may be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, is there a possibility that somebody looks at Mancini Duffy in the future and says, I don't even recognize that entity, that organization, as what we would think of as a traditional architecture practice?
I hope so. That is ultimately the goal. I think that those that know Mancini Duffy from back in its tradition, it's a 100-year-old firm, which is kind of nice. And if you trace those roots back, it has definitely evolved, decade after decade, and it's a very different firm than it was 10 years ago when I started. And it, in order to be relevant, it certainly needs to be different in 10 years from now, for sure. I think there are things coming our way, which, for good or for bad, may or may not change the industry. I think AI as a buzzword is an interesting thing for architects. I don't know if it's going to actually take over anybody's job. To me, it's another tool. I'm actually astonished that it's such a big deal all of a sudden, because I feel like we've been using it for 4 or 5 years now, at least, especially when it comes to image creation.
Yeah.
And again, it's a tool. It's a great tool. It could be an amazing tool. But I don't want to see it just take over bits and pieces of the profession. To me, that's not really using technology for what it should be used for. It should be pushing the profession, not taking over, mundane tasks.
Right, right. So last question, because this is Shadow Shorts. The big takeaway, there's a president, there's a CEO out there of another firm, and they're thinking, okay, yeah, we've got a very traditional practice. I know we need to do something. Like, I love the way you just said it. In 10 years, in order to be relevant, there has to be change. This is one thing we talk about a lot. There's change going on all around us. So how are we going to stay relevant? So that president or CEO is out there and they're wondering, okay, I hear what you're saying, Christian. I hear you saying you're investing all of your profit back into the design lab. That's a big investment, et cetera. A lot of non-billable hours to support the efforts there. But where do I get started? I've got a fairly traditional firm. I need to understand how an architecture firm can be innovative, whatever that means. Where do I start? So what would you tell that CEO or that president of that architecture firm?
Yeah, I would say it's very much in line with how I got started. The president and CEO of MANCINI DUFFY, when I was buying the firm from him or beginning that process, he gave me the leeway to make the changes that I needed to make. And I know it was painful for him. And we've talked about it in years, subsequent years later. But he allowed me to do what I had to do. And he would say, I know you're doing it from a good place. I don't agree with it at all, but just do it. And I think for that CEO and the owners of those companies, look, the architecture world it's an old person's sport, right? I mean, you don't get good until you're 30 years into this profession, let's be honest. But that doesn't mean that the raw talent that you've just hired out of school, or the person that's been working with you for the last 10 years that's looking for their next step, can't be that creative person. And so my advice would be, talk to the staff, spend some time with them and say, what do you want to accomplish? Where do you see innovation potentially in our firm? Where can we start? Give them a little bit of a carrot to start with and let them loose, and know that it may or may not work. I mean, we've gone down the road with all sorts of nonsense that we've pulled the plug on because this is just kind of dumb. Like, well, what are we doing here? We're going down a weird rabbit hole. But it led us to the next thing, and then ultimately to the next thing, and so on and so forth. So it's truly about being vulnerable for that CEO, opening up to their people and saying, look, I don't have the answers for what the next 10 years or 20 years is going to bring our firm, but maybe someone here does.
Yeah. That's great advice. And for, if you're out there, if you are a leader in an architecture firm, think about what Christian's saying here, right? Think about relevance and the tools. There's a difference between digital transformation and innovation. And that's a line that we need to draw. Christian, thank you for this conversation. It's very enlightening. I'm sure it was very eye-opening for a lot of our viewers, a lot of our listeners. One thing I do want to do is, if you want to learn more about MANCINI DUFFY, there's the URL in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen right now. It's manciniduffy.com. There is a tab for the design lab. But their menu at the top of the website there, you can learn more about it and listen to Christian's Anti-Architect podcast. You can find it wherever podcasts are listened to, wherever you download them from, and you'll hear some more eye-opening conversations as you listen to that, or ear-opening maybe is the way to say that. As you listen to the Anti-Architect. And it also leads me to the point that these are the types of conversations. We talked about industrialized construction a little bit. Shadow Summit is coming up. It's the 7th annual Shadow Summit. It's in Atlanta this year, October 24th through 26th. These are the types of conversations that we'll go deep in the weeds on. We call it a summit because it is a place for executives from all across the AEC world, all across the commercial real estate world, to get together and really set the agenda for what we'll do and what we'll talk about for the coming years. So shadowsummit.com is where you can find more information there. We're continually updating the website. More speakers will go up on that page here very soon. More about the agenda as well. But in order to get one of the few tickets that are left, it's intentionally intimate. There's only 200 seats available. That's all the seats that are in the theater, in the auditorium. So that's the limit. There is an apply button right there at the top of the website there at shadowsummit.com. Join us in Atlanta and get into conversations like this. How do we innovate in architecture, engineering, construction, real estate, industrialized construction? AI and machine learning will be on the docket as well. So lots of things to talk about. Christian, thanks again for this conversation. Really appreciate you and everything that you do.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad that you're here. And for everybody that's out here watching or listening live or in some time shifted manner, I'll be back tomorrow at noon Eastern with another conversation with an expert or thought leader in the realm of innovation for the built environment. Until then, have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.